Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. You are now tuned in to Psych Shade. Class is now in session. Greetings, loved ones. Welcome to week 2 of coronavirus psychology. We are now headed into our penultimate key concept. For those wordsmiths at home, that means second to last. So we are looking now at the social cognitive theory. It used to be called social learning theory, so if you see that or hear that, they are the same thing. This is the newer version of it, and it can be an SAQ or an LAQ, and as you see, because it has the word theory at the end, we will need to teacup it in our conclusion if we get that as an LAQ option. Okay, we are now to the point where we are going to create a schema for social cognitive theory before we learn about it anymore. So go ahead and pause this video. There is a reading titled Social Cognitive Theory Background on the class website. Go ahead and open that up, and really you just need to read the first page. We will get to the rest of the material later on in the coming week. Big ideas that we want to address in some way, shape, or form in the intro. The first thing, we're relating this back to social identity theory. A lot of who we learn from is going to be members of our in-group. That's who we identify with, and we as human beings have a need to belong. And so we are going to try to behave the same way as members of our in-group so we can fit in and belong and identify with those other groups of people. Oftentimes, our in-groups are going to establish the norms and behaviors that are acceptable with the people that we identify with. If you break those norms, you are punished, not necessarily explicitly, but maybe you just are not able to fit in and you are not included in things in your in-group, which is troublesome for lots of human beings. The yellow on the bottom of the slide here, I'll give you a couple seconds to maybe jot some ideas down. What are some school norms that in our traditional at Rufus King High School, what are some norms that we have or expectations that we have as a Rufus King student or Rufus King family in group? What are some norms that we've established? You can also think of social settings. So like when you meet someone new, what is a social norm that has been established that you should do? So when you're done jotting this down, take 20-30 seconds, think of some examples for those just to give you some ideas. So really what social cognitive theory is about is how we learn these behaviors or these norms, and it's from watching other people and trying to redirect them through rewards and punishments. And so this is a clip from the Big Bang Theory. I got to admit, Curry and I are not huge Big Bang Theory fans. We don't watch it a ton. I've seen it. But this is a pretty good clip of how psychologists thought people learned behaviors. Because we are focused on learning and how we learn norms and expectations, let's quick define what learning is. And there's a couple underlying things that are really important. So it is a relatively permanent change. So if you quickly study your Spanish flashcards right before the quiz, you get a PR on your Spanish quiz, and you're like, man, I'm really good at Spanish. I'm learning a lot. But then in a week, you have no idea what those words were or how to conjugate verbs. I think that's a thing. Then you didn't really learn it, right? You just quickly refreshed it. That's a short-term memory thing, which we went about in the memory models. So learning really requires a permanent change, something that is there and that you can refer back to confidently later on. And it also is based on an experience, whether that's studying flashcards, whether that's going on a field trip, whether that's rehearsing something over and over and over again in an outline form, whatever it is. But it's something that you do as an experience that permanently changes the way you understand or the way you think about things. Okay, so this is it. This is the theory that we are focusing on, and it was developed by Albert Bandura, who is going to be actually one of our researchers that we used. And he argues that you are going to learn norms and expectations through observing models, people that you can relate to, people that you look up to. You watch them, you see what they do, and you replicate that behavior subconsciously, right? how can we assume that this happens so easily and so seamlessly is really all of the letters under A there. We're constantly surrounded by people. We as human beings are constantly observing the way other people act. We are subconsciously replaying things in our head, at the end of the day, maybe how an interaction went in a lunchroom or how an interaction went in a classroom or something that happened at work. You're constantly rehearsing those interactions subconsciously throughout the day. And if there's motivation, you are going to reproduce that action that you saw. And we're going to talk in a second here about what might motivate you to try to reproduce or replicate an action that you've seen by somebody else throughout your day. So you're probably thinking, well, I observe a lot of behaviors all the time, every day. So what triggers my brain to kick in social cognitive theory where I actually start learning from somebody? Well, it is a combination between observing behavior and then a consequence. And in this case, a lot of times consequence is used as a negative term, but we're thinking of more in a positive frame. And when we have behavior and a positive consequence, that equals learning. So some cognitive factors that influence our ability to socially learn from other people is attention. We're paying attention to the behavior that the model is carrying out. We must remember the behavior. We must be able to imitate or have the potential in order to imitate that behavior. So, for example, if I watched Giannis dunk, allegedly, I don't have the ability or the potential to be able to mimic that behavior. I do have some bounce, but I don't think I could get up like I used to, so I would lack that potential to carry out that modeled behavior. And then lastly, we need motivation. We need a reason to want to carry out that behavior or replicate that that could be a lot of different reasons. So picking up on that idea of factors that actually motivate us to want to learn or replicate behaviors that we see. So the first factor is consistency. So if you see a behavior one time and you never see it again, the chance that you socially learn that behavior is going to be very little. You have to be able to identify and relate with that model, and we'll talk about what types of people we normally relate with best when we talk about social learning. We would like to live vicariously through the models. And really what that's saying is if you see somebody behave in a certain way and good things happen to them, then you want to replicate that. So let's say maybe your older sibling studies a lot, they get really good grades, and they get into a really great college. You want to vicariously live through them in your behaviors and say, well, if they did that and they had successful things happen to them, I want that too. That can also be on the flip side, where you see somebody and you see negative consequences on that behavior, and you realize that, well, I don't want to behave that way. I want to socially learn to adapt my behavior to not experience that negative consequence. The last thing is we are much more likely to be motivated to replicate a behavior of somebody that we like, which is oftentimes somebody we associate with or identify with, which is what our last slide is about. So picking up on that idea of liking models or who we identify with, people we generally identify with are people who are similar or older age. Very rarely do you have a 20-year-old look up to a 9-year-old. That just doesn't make a lot of sense, because you're at a different point in your life and you're either striving for somebody who's at the same point in life or somebody who's older and has achieved success. So really the similar age or older age, science shows that most of the time we have models that are the same gender. We look up to people that are the same gender as us, and also of higher status or people who have achieved more than we have. We generally don't see PhD candidates looking up to high school dropouts. So really those are the three things that people are looking to identify with to model behavior after them. Because we can't really have a true discussion like we would in class, but just some ideas, and maybe we can pick this up in a Zoom session today. Think about the people that you try to imitate, whether that's your parents, probably teachers like Curry and I, obviously, if you have such elite intellect role models that are guiding you every day. Probably us, we're probably on that list. Friends, celebrities, coaches, who are people that you look up to in your life. And like I said, we can carry that on in a Zoom. And after you've thought about that, we are done for today. Make sure you stay safe, wash your hands,